I have a pretty clear genre breakdown in my recent reads that are all from Q1. We are almost halfway through the year, but I am still playing a bit of catch up here. And it is very heavily weighted towards fantasy and sci-fi, so I have devoted this video to talking about the 8 fantasy and sci-fi books that I read in the first quarter and have not talked about yet. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate if you're new here, and I have 8 books that I want to talk about that I have read recently. Only 2 of these are sci-fi, so I have just kind of mixed them all together. I will be talking about them from lowest rated to highest rated. So as I talk about these books, I will give both a rating out of 10, which is based on the compile system. I will have a description of that linked in my description down below. It is designed by G over a Book Roast. And then I will also give a star rating because I know a lot of people use star ratings and that might be a little easier to picture for folks than just a rating out of 10. I am going to be talking about a very popular one first. So I apologize ahead of time to the Wayfarers fans. I have a fairly mixed thoughts on my first try of the first Wayfarers book, Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which for anybody who's not already familiar with that series is by Becky Chambers. So I read this as part of a book club that I do with my friends Kristen from Kristen is Fully Booked, Kristen from Kristen Craves Books, Maria from Maria Might Read That, and Sarah from Brighton Bookish. We had a great discussion, which I will link in the cards so you can check that out if you're curious for more long-form thoughts on it. Ended up giving Long Way to a Small Angry Planet 5.9 out of 10 or 3 stars. I definitely did not hate this, but I think for me it was a confirmation that Becky Chambers' writing style just isn't my particular cup of tea. I do think that I enjoyed this a lot more than her Monk and Robot novella series. So I can say that if you find that series to be a little too preachy or a little too heavy on the themes and light on the characters, I think Wayfarers is definitely more character driven. The main story follows Rosemary Harper, who is this young woman who's basically trying to get away from her past and make a new start. She ends up joining this crew whose job is making new pathways through space for everybody else to use. And they end up taking a contract that brings them into basically uncharted territory. And it reminded me a lot of Mass Effect if you took away the action scenes and some of these bigger moments and were left with primarily the character, like crew interactions. It reminded me a lot of that. And I think it did take me a while to really start to get to know some of these characters and care about them. So it is definitely slow paced and it takes a while to get to know everybody because it's a fairly large crew. But I did end up at least enjoying some of these characters. Even though, again, the writing style is still just not really my cup of tea. I did also like some of the themes that Becky Chambers discusses in here, but I do wish that maybe Chambers had taken on fewer themes and discussed them more fully. It felt like she touched on a lot of things but didn't fully explore them. And it feels sort of episodic in parts. And I had kind of mixed feelings about some of the characters. So I definitely didn't hate this first book, but again, it's just a recognition that almost always cozy fantasy and cozy sci-fi just doesn't have enough oomph for me. The only time I have found sort of quote-unquote cozy stuff that works for me has been T. Kingfisher, because her characters are super relatable for me and her humor is like exactly what I want. So that has honestly been one of very few cozy books that worked for me. Also, you've heard me talk about Emily Wilde, which I talked about in my most recent reads. So occasionally I find one that works. Just unfortunately for this one, I didn't fully love it. And I don't see myself continuing with Wayfarers, both on a writing style level, and I know that the rest of the books in the series focus on certain characters but don't follow others. And it took long enough for me to really enjoy some of these characters that I don't want to invest the time again to then switch tracks to somebody else. So the investment isn't there for me. Okay, moving back to fantasy, I will talk about Witness for the Dead by Katherine Addison. This is technically the second book in the Goblin Emperor world. I think calling it a sequel is a bit of a stretch because you're following a totally different character than in Goblin Emperor, but it's definitely in that same world. Witness for the Dead follows Kelleher, who is an investigator who helped out the young Emperor Maya in Goblin Emperor, and this is almost a day in the life of Kelleher. So Kelleher is what's known as a witness for the dead, hence the title, and he is able to basically get details from dead bodies that normally you wouldn't be able to get just by touching them. He can get a sense of their last memory, so he uses that in order to solve mysteries as he goes through the story. The synopsis for this book leads you to believe it's focusing on a specific murder mystery, and that murder mystery is definitely there, but it's one of several plot threads that are followed because you also get several other cases that he's working on at the same time. And that made this a little disjointed and the pacing a little bit rough for me. I really loved Goblin Emperor because you got to see this young emperor who never thought he was going to be in power, having to step up and learn the political system and try and find out what happened to his predecessors. This one has so many different plot threads to follow, and Kelleher is a much more shy, much more reticent point of view to follow, so it's hard to connect with him immediately until you really start to see him interact with some of the other characters. I think if you didn't like Goblin Emperor, don't pick this up, because it's not only more of the same, it's almost more dense. It expects you to know a lot of information coming in, so if it's been a while since you've read Goblin Emperor, I definitely would recommend rereading or catching up on some of the world terminology before you pick it up. I think what made Goblin Emperor easier was that you're following someone who's new to everything, so you're learning as Maya is learning. Kelleher is already well versed in this world, and there's not a lot of help from Addison because you're expected to kind of just follow along. So I think I definitely enjoyed this, but I also think that it's as dense, if not more, than Goblin Emperor. So if that turned you off, it may not work as well. So I ended up giving this 7.1 out of 10 or 4 stars. And that almost feels a little bit high to me in retrospect. I almost, on a pure enjoyment level, I would give this something more of like a 3.5, but I do really like the world that Addison has built with Goblin Emperor, so it was interesting to see some elements of society that you hadn't really seen in Goblin Emperor. The next one I'm going to talk about is a fantasy romance that is a start to a series, and that is The Magpie Lord by K.J. Charles. I do not remember the name of this series, so I'll try and pop it up here just so you guys have that reference. This follows a young nobleman who has been exiled to China after not getting along with his family, but when everybody else in the family line mysteriously dies, he ends up being drawn back to England in this sort of gas lamp Victorian-ish setting, but with magic. And he has to find out what's going on with the family, why people have died, and has to enlist the help of someone who hates his family. So, and that someone is a magician who has previously been harmed by members of his family. And so it's kind of them trying to figure each other out, like reluctantly helping each other, and kind of investigating this creepy mystery. Apparently I just went ham on the fantasy mysteries in the first quarter here. I think the main thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the banter and the back and forth between Lucien, the new nobleman, or the new lord of this manor, and the magician, Stephen Day, who's coming from much poorer circumstances and is trying to navigate this relationship that could potentially backfire on him. And I just really enjoyed that. I thought the power dynamics were handled pretty well, because anytime one of them stepped out of line, it was called out and they had to have a conversation about it. And I just appreciated that they didn't let that linger and that it was discussed as they went. I think that how much you enjoy that relationship is going to be dependent on how okay you are with sort of a not fully BDSM, but a dominant and more submissive personality mixture. So again, it's very clear that the more submissive person in the pairing is not without power and is choosing to take that role because they want to, but just be aware that it may not work for everybody. The other thing that was a bit of a drawback for me is that there's a bit of Eastern mysticism, kind of awkward handling of the time that Lucien spent in China, and sort of the magic that he learned while he was there. It's just awkward enough that it made me question some things, because I don't think it handles that element perfectly, but it wasn't enough to ruin the enjoyment for me. So again, mileage may vary in how much that bothers you, but I still really enjoyed the book, and I ended up giving it 7.6 out of 10, or 4 stars. The next one I'll talk about is a fantasy western called No Land for Heroes by Cal Black, and this is a self-published sort of action-adventure story. It is pulling sort of genre tropes from westerns and adding in fantastical elements like dragons and magic and certain fantasy races. So it definitely feels both like a western and also somewhat like a fantasy, but I think it is more in the western camp than the fantasy camp, if that makes sense. The story follows a sheriff's deputy, Millie Berry, who is trying to help out the town that she has found herself in as much as she can. She's also trying to raise 2 daughters after having a pretty rough upbringing herself, and basically is just trying to secure their future and protect the people of the town. Unfortunately, she gets the wrong kind of attention, and elements of her past come back to haunt her. So I'm not always a big fan of westerns. I frequently really only like westerns when you are combining them with another subgenre, either fantasy or horror or something like that. Then I get more on board. I don't have a lot of interest in just sort of the frontier lifestyle if there's not other elements in there. But I ended up definitely enjoying this one, and I enjoyed it more for the characters than for anything else. Millie Berry is a very prickly, sort of reactive character who is very quick to defend the people that she cares about, sometimes a little faster than she should be, because she is very willing to take out anyone who's a threat to her found family as well as her daughters. And I kind of appreciated that about her, to be honest. It was refreshing to see a mom who was ready to kick ass and do whatever it took to protect people. And even when it wasn't necessarily the wisest decision, she reminded me a lot of a character like Mal from Firefly. And in fact, the opening sequence of this book reminded me very strongly of Train Job from Firefly, if you're familiar with that show. So she's heart of gold, but also very prickly exterior. There's also a bit of romance. It's not a strong part of this story, but I actually had a really good time with it. I think how much you enjoy that piece of things is going to depend on how okay you are with sort of an arrogant, bantery type side character. I really enjoy that. So I lapped it all up, but other people might feel different. Overall, the story is pretty fast-paced. I had a hard time putting it down once I started, and I think, honestly, the only drawback for me is that it has such a strong Western genre component. The elves have a lot of qualities of indigenous groups in Westerns. I think it's handled better than a lot of the older Westerns are, but it still was so strong with some of even the way they lived and the weapons they used, that for me it was just not fantasy, not as much fantasy as I wanted it to be. And some of the religious elements felt too close to real world for me. So it's just, I feel like this is more of a personal preference and pickiness than necessarily something that's going to bother everybody. But it did end up with me bringing the rating down a little bit just because of that enjoyment level. So I ended up giving it a 7.9 out of 10, or 4 stars. The next one I'm going to talk about is The Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan. I know a lot of people have been picking this up lately and either enjoying it or very much not. I've seen a fair number of people DNF this, and I get it. This is a flintlock fantasy that follows several different points of view from a country that has just overthrown their king and is dealing with putting a new group in power and sort of the ramifications of that, as well as sort of the way the wider world is looking at them. And that's going to make it sound really political fantasy, and it has elements of that, but it's kind of an interesting blend of these political elements with more military style elements, kind of like if you're familiar with Bernard Cornwell's Richard Sharp series. This was born out of McClellan being interested in the TV show version of that, but wanting magic. And he plays around a lot with a magic system that's focused on flintlock guns in particular. So there is a group of wizards isn't the right word, but magic users who are able to use gunpowder and flintlock in order to be better marksmen and better fighters generally. And then there's the more standard sorcerers who have been in power and are threatened by them. So that was the part that is the most interesting to me, is sort of the magic systems and sort of the world building elements. I do enjoy some of the characters, but some of them are freaking obnoxious. So your mileage is definitely going to vary on the characters, and it doesn't do the best job with female representation. All of the point of views are men. Some of the point of views feel similar, so it just depends on how much that works out for you. I do think it's a very approachable flintlock fantasy. It doesn't lean too heavily into the military fantasy or to get too slow with the political fantasy, so it occupies kind of this middle ground. But I know that the beginning was too slow for some of my friends, so I feel like it's one that you just have to pick up and try it. And I recommend the audiobook because the narration that is done is, I can't think of his name at the moment, so I'll pop that on the screen as well. But I think he does a really good job with the different voices and makes it exciting. So if you pick it up, I would definitely recommend going that route if you enjoy audiobooks. This is the third time that I have read Promise of Blood. The first time I gave it 5 stars and absolutely loved it. Again, largely because of the magic systems and a couple characters I really liked. This time around, I gave it 8.1 out of 10, or 4 stars. Now that kind of the rush of the excitement of it is done, I can recognize some of the flaws in this book, and I can see why it doesn't work for everybody. But again, it's one that I still really enjoyed. If you want more detailed thoughts on it, my boyfriend Kendrick and I discussed it. We have a non-spoiler section as well as a spoiler section, so feel free to check that out. I will link that in the cards as well as in the description. The next one is a novella by Tamsyn Muir, and this is Princess Floralinda in the 40 Flight Tower, which is a heck of a title. And this follows a young princess who basically gets trapped in a tower a la Rapunzel. And after a bunch of suitors basically fail to rescue her, has to rescue herself and get out of this tower. This is I would call this a fairly grim style fairy tale where there are some somewhat gruesome elements. The princess is trying to figure out, she's really only been trained to be a princess, but now she has to fight her way out of this tower. And she is not necessarily the most likable of figures. But there's a lot of commentary on princesses and fairy tales in a way that I found really enjoyable, but I think you have to have you have to at least enjoy a bit of dark humor and sort of toxic relationships in order to really get into this one. So I think I'm definitely glad that I read it, and I really appreciate what Muir was doing with fairy tales and princesses in this, but I think it's going to work well for a specific type of reader. I did end up reading this via audiobook, which is narrated by Muir Quirk, who has done Muir's Locked Tomb series, and she's fantastic as always. I really loved the voices. It was just, I think it's a novella, so it was only a couple hours for the audiobook, and it was just an absolute blast to listen to her go on this adventure, basically. So I loved it. It is not... I think it's easy to compare this to something like Tress, which is very lighthearted and very fun, kind of send-up of fairy tales. And Princess Floralinda is a more grim, subversive take on that. So it's fun to they're both doing similar things of making fun of these tropes, but in very different ways. So that's, I think, the best way I can describe it to set your expectations right. So we are to the last fantasy book that I will be talking about for this recent reads, and that is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in a duology. The second book is Crooked Kingdom, for anyone who's not familiar, and I wish I had already picked up Crooked Kingdom because I have a feeling I'm going to end up rereading Six of Crows before I get back to that duology, but this was just an absolute blast. So Six of Crows is a really fun blend of a sort of fantasy heist and more sort of fantasy gang elements, a la something like Peaky Blinders. So I didn't think that would appeal to me, but I freaking loved this. And I am a fan of heists, so I think that definitely was a big part of what won me over, but I also really enjoyed the characters in this. It follows Kaz Brecker, who is the leader of this sort of young, up-and-coming gang that has been slowly building a name for themselves in this industrial revolution era city. Kaz has been offered this opportunity for a once-in-a-lifetime heist, and he gathers this crew from several of the people in his gang to kind of pull off this heist. And you get not only Kaz's point of view, but a couple of the other crew members. There's a lot of fun reveals in this story as it goes along. I was honestly more impressed with the plotting in Six of Crows than in the character work, which is kind of the opposite of what I expected going into this. Because people talk a lot about how great the characters are, and I think they're good. It's just, for me, I had a couple that I got really attached to, and the others, I saw glimpses of things that I could really like, but I didn't fully get attached to them. But the plot, on the other hand, I just loved the way the heist was structured, and I loved the reveals as it went, and it was just so fun. I would definitely reread this, and I will need to reread this before I get to Crooked Kingdom. But I just had such a good time reading it, and I am excited to get back into it once I have the time for doing that. I ended up giving this 9.3 out of 10 or 5 stars. Alright, so now we are to the final book that I will be talking about, which is my favorite book of the first quarter. It is a sci-fi. I think this is technically considered a space opera, but I think that sets incorrect expectations for folks. And that is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. I loved this book. It is the first book in the Tykes Kalan duology, which follows a young ambassador, Mahit Dismar, who ends up traveling from her small mining station to the heart of this massive empire because her predecessor has just died, and so she is sent to replace him and has to navigate all of the politics of this imperial court and make sure that she does the best she can for her mining station, and find out what happened to her predecessor and if that's something that might also threaten her. I think what really works for me in A Memory Called Empire is a very specific thing that I think isn't necessarily going to work for everyone. I adore the writing style in this because Arkady Martine has a very particular way of writing that is often metaphorical. She likes to draw in metaphors that give you this really visual imagery, but not in a super flowery way, but it does make the writing kind of on the dense side. She's also super particular about her word choice. She's conveying a lot of meaning with the words that she's using, but it's also, some of it is stuff that's not necessarily super approachable. So I can see where people might bounce off on the writing style. As someone who is a history and a language nerd, this was top tier. I can't think of very many things that I immediately loved as much as I immediately loved A Memory Called Empire. I really loved seeing Mahit navigate these political environments. She's a very smart, very observant character who starts off sort of being a duck out of water, doesn't really understand. She thinks she understands how the Empire works until she gets there and realizes that it's a lot bigger than she thinks. So she starts that way, but I enjoyed watching her navigate this. She never feels fully helpless to me, which I appreciate. I love a smart character who is using their intelligence and using their skills at observation in order to help themselves. So I loved that about Mahit. I really enjoyed the world building elements of this. There's a ton of themes around empire and colonization that I found really appealing. So again, I think you have to be okay with slow-paced, very politically driven sci-fi that is not, it's a space opera in the sense that you're dealing with this galactic level empire, but it is not like a fast-paced shoot 'em up spaceships battle scenario. You get more of that in the sequel, but even then it's still kind of on the slower pace side. You just get more expansion of the world in the second one. So I would definitely recommend this to fans of political fantasy, more character-driven readers who enjoy a very smart, capable main character who might be a little out of their depth. So, again, I absolutely loved it. It's hard for me not to just gush about this book nonstop because it was an immediate favorite for me, but I also can see why it doesn't work for everybody. So let me know if you've picked this one up because it is so near and dear to my heart. Even if you don't like it, I'd still be curious to hear your thoughts on it. And that holds true for all of the other books that I have talked about here. If you've read any of them, definitely let me know. I always love to hear what people think, even if it's totally different from my opinions. It's just fun to talk about. I will see you in the final wrap-up of my Q1 recent reads, which is going to be mystery and horror-based. Bye!